The history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is concerned with the final decades of existence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the period during which the declining state pursued wide-ranging reforms and was subjected to 3 partitions by the neighboring powers, coincides with the election and reign of the Federation's last king, Stanisław August Poniatowski. During the later part of the 18th century, the Commonwealth attempted fundamental internal reforms. The reform activity provoked hostile reaction and eventually military response on the part of the surrounding states. The second half of the century brought improved economy and significant growth of the population. The most populous capital city of Warsaw replaced Danzig as the leading trade center, and the role of the more prosperous urban strata was increasing. The last decades of the independent Commonwealth existence were characterized by intense reform movements and far-reaching progress in the areas of education, intellectual life, arts and sciences, and especially toward the end of the period, evolution of the social and political system. The royal election of 1764 resulted in the elevation of Stanisław August Poniatowski, a refined and worldly aristocrat connected to a major magnate faction, but hand-picked and imposed by Empress Catherine II of Russia, who expected Poniatowski to be her obedient follower. The king accordingly spent his reign torn between his desire to implement reforms necessarily to save the state, and his perceived necessity of remaining in subordinate relationship with his Russian sponsors. The Bar Confederation of 1768 was a Szlachta rebellion directed against Russia and the Polish king, fought to preserve Poland's independence and in support of Szlachta's traditional causes. It was brought under control and followed in 1772 by the first partition of the Commonwealth, a permanent encroachment on the outer Commonwealth provinces by the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia and Habsburg Austria. The partition Sejm, under duress, ratified the partition fait accompli. In 1773 the Sejm established the Commission of National Education, a pioneering in Europe government education authority. The long-lasting Sejm convened by Stanisław August in 1788 is known as the Great or 4-year Sejm. The Sejm's landmark achievement was the passing of the May 3 Constitution, the first in modern Europe's singular pronouncement of a supreme law of the state. The reformist but moderate document, accused by detractors of French Revolution sympathies, soon generated strong opposition coming from the Commonwealth's upper nobility, conservative circles and Catherine II. Determined to prevent a rebirth of a strong Commonwealth, the nobility's Targowica Confederation appealed to the Empress for help. In May 1792 the Russian army entered the territory of the Commonwealth. The defensive war fought by the forces of the Commonwealth ended when the king, convinced of the futility of resistance, capitulated by joining the Targowica Confederation. The Confederation took over the government, but Russia and Prussia in 1793 arranged for and executed the second partition of the Commonwealth, which left the country with critically reduced territory, practically incapable of independent existence. The radicalized by the recent events reformers, in the still nominally Commonwealth area and in exile, were soon working on national insurrection preparations. Tadeusz Kosciuszko was chosen as its leader. The popular general came from abroad and on March 24, 1794 in Krakow declared a national uprising under his command. Kosciuszko emancipated and enrolled in his army many peasants, but the hard-fought insurrection, strongly supported also by urban plebeian masses, proved incapable of generating the necessary foreign collaboration and aid. It ended suppressed by the forces of Russia and Prussia, with Warsaw captured in November. The third and final partition of the Commonwealth was undertaken again by all 3 partitioning powers. and in 1795 the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth effectively ceased to exist. Economic transformations and beginnings of capitalist development, revitalized economy, serfdom, agricultural rent and hired labor commencing primarily in the second half of the 18th century. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth experienced economic transformations, which culminated in the formation of a capitalist system a century later. The more advanced West European countries were a source of examples of economic progress and formulated the ideology of enlightenment, which provided theoretical foundations for the Polish undertakings. Industrial development, population growth and frequent warfare in the West increased the demand for agricultural products, which resulted in improved for the agriculture-dominated Commonwealth market situation. For the 1760s, prices kept growing for farm and forest products imported from the East. The Commonwealth's grain exports reached again the high levels of the early 17th century. The internal market for produce was making gradual progress as well, because of increasing population of towns and because of urban people abandoning the agricultural labor market, which many of them had joined in times of high economic stress. Agricultural producers were able again to invest in the trade. Despite these favorable conditions, the degree of the economic change and whether it had reached a turning point is a matter of dispute. The Commonwealth started from a very low level of economic activity early in the 18th century, and its rate of growth remained less than half of that of highly developed countries, such as England or France. The relative economic backwardness had therefore remained and was one of the underlying reasons for the political and military weakness of the state, because of conservative resistance to changes. Despite a multitude of self-help books available, agricultural economy and agrarian social relations were changing slowly. Potato cultivation was becoming more common first in Silesia and Pomerania. More typically, agricultural improvements were being introduced in the western provinces of the Commonwealth, Greater Poland and Pomerania, but overall grain yields had not yet reached the productivity of the Renaissance economy. Enlightenment political and economic publicists had become preoccupied with promoting fundamental alteration of social aspects of agricultural production, in particular with serfdom and the necessity of its reform. Insufficient productivity and quality of output of fallback enterprises was increasingly forcing the Szlachta operators to supplant or supplement the overburdened serf labor with agricultural hired workforce and rent of farmland. A pool of agricultural laborers, the loose people, are often subjected to restrictions, were in demand and enticed by published wage tariffs in times of labor shortages. Feudal rent offered enterprising peasants more independence and ability to get ahead, if fees were reasonable. Such alternative arrangements were practiced in a minority of landed estates, most often in the western provinces of the Commonwealth. Oppressive serfdom had remained the dominant form of agricultural production throughout the vast ranges of Poland and Lithuania. Manufacturing industry and trade. The level of economic prosperity in the Commonwealth was largely determined by its agricultural production, but for the fundamental transformation that the country experienced in the second half of the 18th century. The changes taking place in the cities and within the industrial sphere were of crucial importance. At the outset, manufacturing and crafts were underdeveloped in comparison with Prussia, Austria and Russia. The hurried efforts to close the half-century delay and industrialization gap that took place especially during the last 3 decades of the Commonwealth's existence were only partially successful. The industrialization process, initiated by landed magnates in the first half of the 18th century, intensified during its second half, when burgher entrepreneurship also became a significant competitor component. Important for the development of manufacturing, mining and industrial financing was the leadership of King Stanisław August Poniatowski. For the early years of his reign, production workshops were most highly developed in the cities of Greater Poland, in Danzig and Pomerelia, Warsaw, Krakow area, and some magnate estates in the east. Of the heavy industries, iron production and processing had become most significant, especially in the old Polish industrial region. The second half of the 18th century brought also heavy industry to the border region of Upper Silesia. The stronger position of urban entrepreneurs was also a result of the revitalized trade. Under the king's leadership, steps were taken that led to the abolishment of nobility's monopoly on various trade activities, which made capital concentration in the hands of burgher merchants feasible. The Commonwealth was, however, being subjected to discriminatory trade practices imposed by Prussia, Austria and Russia. The Commonwealth's stronger neighbors, paved roads and inland waterways were constructed or improved by state authorities to facilitate the increased trade. Burgher-dominated investment financing and general lending, previously concentrated in Danzig, was now done mainly in Warsaw and also in Poznan. The huge fortune accumulated by the banker Piotr Tepe, who came from a non-noble family, was an indication of changing times. The Commonwealth's balance of trade was negative until the 1780s. The decreased role of Danzig was in part due to the Prussian harassment of the city. Prussian policies also weakened the previously vital exchanges between Silesia and the Commonwealth. Warsaw, the new great commercial center, was crucial for the considerably intensified internal trade. There were also regional trade centers such as Krakow, which served western Lesser Poland and eastern Upper Silesia. The first partition lessened trade contacts with southern Lesser Poland and Pomerania, incorporated into Austria and Prussia. Social evolution and early formation of a modern nation. Changing population patterns during the partitions period, peasantry. Early social transformations of the multinational, nobility-dominated Commonwealth population were taking place during the period of the three partitions. To varying degrees they affected all the main strata of the society, peasants, burghers and nobility. The ethnic composition of the Commonwealth was changing with the reduced territory. The population, estimated at no more than 7 million at the end of the Great Northern War, acquired a few additional millions by the time of the first partition. Western Poland was much more densely populated than the vast areas in the east. After the second partition, the much reduced territory contained only 4 million inhabitants. Peasants constituted 3/4 of the pre-partition's population, the growing urban strata 17 to 20%, and the nobility with clergy 8 to 10%. The population before the first partition was 2/3 ethnically Polish Apollinized, with the minorities distributed primarily among the non-noble classes. There were compact concentrations of ethnically Polish settlement west and north of the pre-1772 Commonwealth borders. Most of Upper Silesia, parts of Lower Silesia up to Breslau region, Pomerania up to Śląsk Miastko at the western edge, and parts of southern East Prussia. Numerous in the western and northern Commonwealth Germans constituted a minority there, except for Ulawi and northern Warmia, where they predominated. The Jews, who in many respects constituted a separate state, were scattered throughout the country and may have had totaled 750,000, of which 2/3 lived in the cities, where the merchants and tradesmen were economically very active. The first partition reduced the proportion of ethnically Polish population to just over 50% of the Commonwealth's total. Half of all Poles now live in Prussia and Austria. Prussian and Austrian authorities introduced Germanization policies in ethnically contested areas before and during the partitions, which supported settler colonization and restrictions on the use of the Polish language, beginning with Frederick II, Maria Theresa and Joseph II. The state of the peasantry and the issue of improving the lot became one of the leading interests and preoccupations of reformist publicists, chief among them the king. The Sejm of 1768 barred feudal lords from imposing the death penalty on the serf subjects, but an attempt to regulate peasants' rights further in the 1780s Zamoyski Code was unsuccessful. Only in 1791 the May 3 Constitution generally took the peasantry under the protection of the law, a more decisive, but short-lived effort to advance the rights of the peasants was the proclamation of Poland promulgated by Tadeusz Kosciuszko in 1794, before the demise of the Polish-Lithuanian state. After the first partitions, peasants enjoyed limited legal rights under the Prussian jurisdiction, but more meaningful protection and implemented reforms in Austria. In the Commonwealth, California, 64% of the peasants lived and worked within the estates of private feudal lords, where conditions differed considerably. The 19% in the royal domains and 17% on church lands had experienced more systematic improvements in several aspects of the situation. The second half of the 18th century brought more intense stratification of the peasant class, from an increase in the numbers of the extremely pauperized element to the evolving establishment of affluent peasant groups. The educational level of the rural serf population was improving very slowly, despite the efforts of the Commission of National Education. In times of the existential threat, the idea of national self-defense was met with some peasant response already during the Confederation of Bar, and to a much greater extent at the time of the Kosciuszko uprising. Burghers and nobles, as in many other European countries, the Enlightenment in the Polish-Lithuanian state was a period of great advancement of the burgher class, the upper ranks of which consisted of urban business and professional people, whose economic position was growing stronger and who sought corresponding expansion of political standing and influence. In the middle of the 18th century, the towns and their inhabitants were still in miserable shape, especially in Lithuania. In Poznan Voivodeship, urban people constituted California. 30% of the population in the eastern provinces below 10%. Danzig, the largest city, fell below 50,000 residents. Warsaw counted less than 30,000. Because of the state protection and revitalized economy, the situation improved during the last decades of the Commonwealth's existence, with Warsaw exceeding 100,000 around 1790. Other cities grew more slowly, e.g. Krakow and Poznan reached 20,000 residents each. During the Convocation Sejm of 1764, nobility-staffed commissions of good order were established. They took some measures aimed at improving urban economics, but the record was mixed, and it was not until the Great Sejm era that significant reforms were implemented. From 1775, nobles were no longer barred from practicing the urban professions. In 1791, burghers of royal cities were given the right to purchase rural property, granted court privileges and access to state offices and the same, while Szlachta members had the prohibition from holding offices in town governments removed. The urban self-governing institutions were allowed to proceed and develop without interference and were placed under legal protection. The burgher state had now found itself in a situation favorable in comparison with that of the Brethren in Silesia, or in the strictly government-controlled areas appropriated by Prussia after the first partition, which were also subjected to German colonizing activity at the expense of Polish urban people. The Austrian partition towns experienced lack of significant economic progress. The early capitalist development brought new elements of social stratification in the cities, including the emergent during the last decade of independence intelligentsia, the banker, manufacturing and trade elites, and the fast-growing plebeian propertyless groups, the nascent proletariat. The laws and reforms of 1764, 1791 and 1793 granted privileges primarily to the propertied and literate urban establishments. The economically and politically advancing burgher class was becoming increasingly important in the cultural life of the Commonwealth, beginning with the German culture-inspired intellectual activity at Danzig and Thorn around the middle of the 18th century, and culminating with wealthy Warsaw townspeople of the final years of the Republic who built urban palaces and patronized cultural endeavors. The scientist and writer Stanisław Staszic, a leading figure in the Polish Enlightenment, was the most prominent of the non-noble intellectuals of the period. The urban intelligentsia, crucial in the dissemination of the Enlightenment ideology, originated both from impoverished szlachta and from urban families. Some of the strongest supporters of the national reform movement and leaders of the Kosciuszko uprising's left wing originated from that group. Many burgher sons attended leading educational institutions in the Commonwealth and abroad. Radical ideas and currents were readily assimilated by the politically very active elements of Warsaw's lower classes. Members of this group massively supported reformist postulates of the Great Sejm, promoted the French Revolution ideals, helped distribute political literature, and were the faction that matured and became indispensable during the insurrection. The majority of the nobility wanted to preserve its privileged position, opposed reforms during the early years of King Stanisław August and opposed the Zamoyski Code. In the final act of obstruction, many nobles joined the anti-reform Targowica Confederation in 1792. The leading magnate class, rich, cosmopolitan and educated, became worlds apart from the regular gentry. Their estates in many cases became divided by the partitions, and many magnates willingly served foreign interests. Although there was a reformist minority that included political activists such as Andrzej Zamoyski and Ignacy Potocki, the middle nobility was more negatively affected by the first partition in areas under Prussian and Austrian control and suffered heavy losses. During and after the Bauer Confederation revolt and uprising, a great majority of older gentry and of those in the more distant regions of the country followed the traditional Sarmatism ways and style, while many of the younger and in closer contact with the Warsaw court circles were increasingly inspired by foreign patterns, especially the French fashion, and followed the often utopian Enlightenment trends. After the first partition, out of the total of 700,000 nobles in the Commonwealth, a majority belonged to the diverse petty nobility stratum. Members of this group possessed little or no property and were rapidly becoming degraded, because under the changing political and social circumstances the work they had traditionally provided for the wealthy were no longer in high demand. The petty gentry clung to nominal szlachta privileges for as long as possible, but they were losing the status and were often forced to become hired laborers or to move to cities. The Great Sejm in 1791 conditioned participation in local assemblies on rural property minimum yearly income. In some measure the society was becoming more egalitarian, as new statutes made it easier for upper-class burghers to gain the nobility status. From now on the social status would partially, but increasingly, depend on wealth. In the second half of the 18th century, the growing Freemasonry movement, which included most prominent personalities of the era and was not limited to nobles, was an important factor in promoting egalitarian ways of thinking. A modern concept of a nation as a community of all social classes was beginning to take hold even among szlachta ideologists.